Welcome to the Football Debates Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Debates. In this episode, we're going to discuss culture, the differences between a winning and a losing culture, how championship teams shape their culture, and how star players can also help shape the culture within an organization. Oftentimes, you'll see a team hire a new head coach. Usually, it's an offensive or defensive coordinator from a successful team that is brought into a losing team that has the hope of changing the culture of that losing team and bringing some aspects from the successful club in so that way that they can change the attitude in their building. But just hiring a new coach and having them say at their introductory press conference that we're going to change the culture around here is a lot easier said than done. A culture change actually needs to start from the ownership on down all the way to the custodians in the building. Everyone needs to take part in that culture change for it to really actually be effective and beneficial. So to begin with, we need to define what culture is. Culture is the shared set of attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs of a team. Oftentimes it's defined as the way we do things around here or the way things are done here. Well, that's a very general statement. It is very factual. Championship teams have a set of standards that everyone needs to adhere to, whether it's the coaching staff, whether it's the star player, whether it's the last player on the roster. Successful teams will have a set of standards that everyone needs to live up to and that everyone is held accountable to. Oftentimes on losing teams, they have standards also, but not everyone is held accountable. Not everyone is expected to hit a particular standard. Oftentimes star players are allowed to not meet a certain threshold where the last man on the roster is. The last man on the roster doesn't meet that threshold, they're cut, while the star player is given a pass or is forgiven, or a coach or an owner makes the excuse of, well, that's just how they are. But that culture is what makes teams consistent losers or consistent winners. A good video series to watch that helps you understand what culture really is a series that you can find on YouTube. It's called America's Game. And it's produced by NFL Films. And what they do in that series is they look at every Super Bowl winning team, starting with Super Bowl I, the Green Bay Packers, up to the most recent Super Bowls. And they interview three members of that team. Sometimes it's a coach and a couple of players. Sometimes it's three players. Sometimes it's offensive or defensive players. But they interview them and they talk about what happened the season before or prior to the season, events during the course of the season that helped shape the team and make them a champion, and then what happened during their postseason run and what aspects that had as far as affecting their championship. But it's a great series that shows how players would play for each other, not just with each other. A common theme that I saw when I watched almost all the videos, I haven't gotten through all of them yet, but a common theme is that the players hold each other accountable, but players also didn't want to let their teammates down. They became more than just teammates. They became, in a sense, a form of family. Whether it was the offense letting the defensive down or the right guard not wanting to let the right tackle in the center down, it didn't matter. The players would hold each other accountable, and that accountability developed trust and developed a sense of worth for the individual players where they didn't want to be the weak link on the team. They didn't want to be the defensive back that blew the coverage that gave up the touchdown. They didn't want to be the offensive lineman that missed the block. So the players would hold themselves accountable, hold each other accountable, and oftentimes they would hold the coaching staff accountable. If coaches made bad decisions or bad plays, the players sometimes would talk about that too, how they disagreed with what the coach initially did, and they let them know that. The coaches would talk about holding players accountable. And as you watch this series, you can see that consistently throughout the championship teams, starting with the teams of the 70s, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Miami Dolphins, the Dallas Cowboys, and some of the teams that didn't necessarily win championships, like the Minnesota Vikings. The Oakland Raiders only won one Super Bowl during the 70s, but they were consistently good. And what you saw in all these teams were a set of standards And during these videos, the players talked about how much fun they had with not just playing with each other on the field, but a lot of times they would associate and be around each other off the field. And that camaraderie, that bond, again, helped with that trust and helped with that accountability factor. The teams that I mentioned in the 70s, Pittsburgh, Miami, the Oakland Raiders, Dallas Cowboys, and Minnesota Vikings. While Minnesota didn't win a championship, they still made it to 4 Super Bowls. In fact, those 5 teams were the 17 representatives out of the 22 teams that played in the Super Bowl between 1970 and 1980. And all those teams had good, solid head coaches, good schemes, but the thing was they had coaches that held players accountable. And you saw this continue through into the 80s. You had San Francisco, the New York Giants, Washington, and even some teams, again, that didn't win championships, like the Denver Broncos and the Cleveland Browns. Denver and Cleveland, they played each other 3 times for the right to go to the Super Bowl. Denver won every time, but Cleveland was right there, and Cleveland had that head coach who held people to standards, just like San Francisco did, just like New York did. That head coach, Marty Schottenheimer, then moved on to Kansas City in the 90s. Well, look what happened. Kansas City became very good, and throughout the 90s, Kansas City, while they didn't get to a Super Bowl, they were still one of the better teams in the NFL throughout much of the 90s. And as we got into the 90s, the first part of the 90s, you had San Francisco carrying over from the 80s. You had Dallas, who won 3 Super Bowls in just a few years. You had Buffalo, who made 4 straight Super Bowls. Towards the end of the 90s, you had Green Bay and Denver, 2 teams whose head coaches came from San Francisco and brought that winning attitude, that winning culture, and held people to standards, again, high standards, that everyone was expected to meet. Again, didn't matter if it was a star player or the last man on the roster. Everyone had to meet these standards. And as you get into the early 2000s, you had the Patriots, obviously, with their run in the early 2000s. You had Green Bay, who's had a continuous run. Pittsburgh became dominant once again. Baltimore and Philadelphia. All of these teams, again, high standards and a certain culture. There's a book called The Patriot Way that talks about this also. It talks about how players that have to fit the system and have belief in their coaches, and where everyone is held accountable and to that high set of standards. You need more than just the standards and the coaches saying that you have to be held accountable. All teams need, in a sense, a good cop and a bad cop, so to speak. They need a coach who is willing to call out anyone, whether it's a star player or other members on the staff, and they can do it in a variety of ways. You oftentimes had a head coach who was a dictator type. For example, Bill Parcells, head coach of the Giants for much of the 80s, he would call out anybody, star players, assistant coaches, and he would tell them that that's not how we do things here, that's not the standard, and he would get after people for failing to do their job. Bill Walsh, head coach of the 49ers, he used a little bit of a different tactic. The position coaches got very close to the players, and oftentimes Walsh, if something wasn't up to his standard, he would make a comment to the assistant coach that he made sure the players would hear. The players oftentimes were so close to the assistant coach that they realized, hey, the assistant coach is getting chewed out because we didn't do our job. We didn't maintain that standard. So the players would try and bring it up a notch. So while Bill Walsh was chastising the assistant coach, it was really chastising the players through the assistant coach. If you have a head coach that is more of a soft touch, a mother's milk type, Andy Reid of the Chiefs, who was a coach for Philadelphia in the early 2000s and had them on a nice run and even got them to a Super Bowl, he's always seen as more of a soft touch type of coach. And if you have that as a head coach, you need to have somebody who's willing to be the dictator type, be the bad cop as an assistant coach. It can be a position coach, it can be one of the coordinators, it might be the strength and conditioning coach, but it's someone who isn't going to be afraid to call out any player on the roster if they see them not performing well, not doing something right. And it could be something that happened in a game, or it could be something that happens in practice. And it might be a simple little drill, but if the head coach has a certain standard that they need maintained, the players are expected to have that, even if it's a simple little drill in practice. And all of that is going to the culture to get all the players, all the coaches, all on the same page. There's a quote from Hall of Fame college coach Bear Bryant that I like. He says, "You must learn how to hold a team together. You must lift some men up, calm others down until finally they've got one heartbeat. Then you've got yourself a team." That's a great example of the culture. Everyone being on the same page, everyone pulling together, everyone having each other's backs, everyone holding each other accountable. There's another great example of culture that you can watch if you have Apple Plus TV. It's called Ted Lasso. While yes, I know it's a TV show and it's all scripted, the show is a perfect example of a coach that is developing culture over X's and O's. For those of you who aren't aware, Coach Ted Lasso is an American football coach who becomes a soccer coach in England. He doesn't know anything about the game. He relies on his assistants to establish that knowledge of the game, teach him about the game, and do all of the coordinator type of jobs. Ted is simply a culture coach. He's trying to affect the culture, change the culture, and mold the culture that he wants. Doesn't mean that he doesn't know what he's doing, but it's the same type of thing with a good cop, bad cop type of relationship. You can't just have a head coach that is just good at the X's and O's. They have to connect with all the players on the roster. If the new head coach was an offensive coordinator, he just can't have a great bond with the offensive players. He has to touch base with the defensive players and the special teams players, the last men on the roster. So that way everyone understands that they're on the same page, they're working together for that common goal. Good head coaches, oftentimes, as I mentioned in an earlier video, are like CEOs. They have to see the bigger picture. And that's what culture coaches try to do. Mold everyone together, and the X's and O's, the coordinators, will take care of themselves. Another good example of a culture being established is about the 1980 U.S. hockey team, the gold medal team, the Miracle team. When they made a movie about that, I believe it was around 2000, 2002, they had Kurt Russell starring as head coach Herb Brooks. And there are several scenes in that movie where Kurt Russell, being Brooks, establishes the culture. There's a scene in the movie where he tells the players that have just made the team, "I'm your coach, I'm not your friend. You want a friend? See the assistant coach, see the trainer. I'm not your friend, I'm the guy in charge." And he pushed them to their limits so that way the players had to rely on each other. He tried to break down regional rivalries of players so that way they trusted each other and became a team. There's another scene in the movie where when they're initially selecting the team, someone says to him, "You're passing on some of the best players." And his response is, "I'm not looking for the best players, I'm looking for the right ones." Culture is more about a team molding together than just the X's and O's. If players don't get along, if players can't trust each other, if players don't feel a brotherhood with each other, then at the professional level, they're just in it for a paycheck. They're mercenaries, and they're not going to stick around, and they may not give that extra effort, and they may not be concerned about letting their teammate down. I did my job, it was the other guy that failed. Building that culture, having everyone rely on each other, and understanding that in a sense you have a common enemy, whether it's a coach saying, "Hey, it's us against the world," or it's the coach trying to be the bad guy to bond the players together so they see the coach as the bad guy. So that way they mold and become a team together. You can also have star players affect culture. Sometimes you have a star player that doesn't fit in with what the rest of the team is trying to do. They don't match up with that team concept. And sometimes having a star player is more of a distraction than helping the team win. If there's a star player that in a sense is more humble or is willing to be chewed out by the head coach or willing to do even the most basic things like any other player on the roster, that superstar player will help set the culture. And if the other players see that star player doing the little things, doing the basic things, or see them getting chewed out by the head coach for making a mistake on a basic drill, the other players will realize, yes, it's a star player, but they're being held to the same standard. They're being held accountable. And just because you have a star player, that doesn't guarantee success. For example, there are several teams right now that have some very good players, even sometimes star players, that you have one star player, but that doesn't necessarily lead to success. The Cleveland Browns right now have arguably one of the best defensive players in the game in Myles Garrett. Yet, since the team was reformed in 1999, they've only made the playoffs 2 or 3 times. The Raiders have Max Crosby, another one of the best defensive players in the league, but they've been one of the worst teams for almost 20 years now. Having a winning culture is good because players play with each other and for each other. But you can also have a losing culture where if something goes wrong, it continues to snowball. And players start thinking, well, here we go again. And that losing attitude and that losing culture is a product of a variety of different things. Sometimes it's poor ownership. Sometimes it's poor decision-making by ownership. A couple of good examples of that is the Washington Commanders team. Under their previous owner, who ran the team for about 20 years, every year they won free agency. They spent the most money, they got the best free agents, but they weren't winning anything. They were changing coaches every 2 or 3 years. So the culture changed. The players that one coach would bring in didn't fit the system of the new coach. And there was constant change. Sometimes the ownership is meddling. Right now, many people believe that the Cleveland Browns are struggling because the ownership meddles too much. They don't let the coaches do what they need to do. And that constant attitude, the constant changing of coaches, the constant changing of culture leads to not a winning culture, but a continuous losing culture. You need to have one voice setting the culture. I believe that it needs to be the head coach. Unless the head coach and the ownership and the general manager are all on the same page, it really should be the head coach setting the tone, setting the culture, setting the standard of how things are done. And it doesn't matter if the coach has the best technically sound system. It doesn't matter if they're an X's and O's genius. They can't connect with the players, then it doesn't matter if they're a great coach or not. They need to have that culture, and everyone needs to be together. Former college football coach Pat Dye has a quote that says, "Football is not an I game, it's a we game." While you have superstar players, Max Crosby and Myles Garrett, they're great defensive players, but they don't play quarterback. I don't remember the last time I saw Patrick Mahomes playing safety on the defensive side of the ball. Football is much more of a team game than basketball or hockey or baseball. All of those sports, the players have to play both offense and defense, whether it's a star player or the last man on the roster. Football is a bit of a different game in that you have defensive players and offensive players only. Sometimes you'll have a player for a certain package or to try and catch the other team off guard. You'll have a defensive player playing offense. Oftentimes, offensive and defensive players will play special teams. So it has to be a we game. It has to be a unit of togetherness. And that culture, bringing everyone together, making everyone realize that they have the same goal, and holding each other accountable to support each other and to try to build that brotherhood and that bond, so that way you can have team success. So that's just a little bit of a look at culture and why I think it's important in the NFL and in college football today. Once again, this is the Football Debates Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Debates. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and we'll see you on our next episode.